They pushed the paper toward me like they were passing a check. The dining table gleamed under the chandelier, the oak polished to a mirror. At the top of the page, in thin, official letters, it said, "Property Transition and Succession Agreement." I read it the way you read bad news, slow, line by line, looking for the part that might be a mistake. The mistake didn't exist. It was all there, neat and surgical, a lifetime whittled into paragraphs. "You don't need to sign anything right now," Marcus said, the same soft, practiced cadence he used in meetings. Claire sat ramrod straight across from me, hands folded, the kind of posture that had served her well in corporate rooms. Sophie watched like she had been taught to watch, neutral, small movements, no sudden emotions. They looked at me like they'd rehearsed the scene until the lines felt natural. The line that stopped my breath was hidden in the legalese. The occupant, that would be me, may remain on the premises in guest quarters, contingent on behavior and mental clarity. Guest quarters. Contingent on behavior. As if I were a tenant and not the woman who'd signed the papers, who'd worked the property, who'd buried the man I'd been married to for 30 years under an old cottonwood in the southeast pasture. I stood up. My hands were steady. "I won't sign," I said. Simple. Final. They traded glances with the ease of people who expected concession, then disappointment when I didn't give it. Marcus tried calm. Claire tried reason. "It's for your security," Marcus insisted. "It protects you," Claire said with that syrupy cadence she thought I'd like. I walked out onto the back porch and let the cold of an early New York morning find me. The Hudson Valley stretched gray and patient beyond the tree line. The sky could be a judgment or a promise, depending on how you wanted to read it. I've commanded convoys and run supply chains across deserts. I've read classified documents by lamplight while planes screamed overhead. None of those things taught me how my own blood might try to make me disappear from a life I had built. Inside, they'd made a business of me. Outside, the land smelled of thaw and earth, Salt Hollow Farm, 700 acres of fields and stone walls, and the house where I'd raised my family remembered who had lived here. It remembered mornings spent tallying calf births beside Theodore's old ledger, afternoons fixing fence after a storm, nights sitting vigil over his hospital bed until they rolled him gently into the ground. I went to the old footlocker in the study where I kept papers nobody thought I valued. Property deeds, wartime topographical maps stamped with Department of Defense ink, Thomas's handwriting on a yellowed scrap about conservation and legacy. He had been a private kind of man when it came to plans. He didn't want to worry me when his ideas were half-formed. He trusted me with the paperwork. That was his way of trusting me to keep the world in order. Frank Russo showed up the next afternoon like he always had, reliable, solid, the kind of man you could call at dawn and know he'd be there at noon. We sat at my kitchen table while he flipped through documents. "They're trying to paint you unstable," he said, eyes hard as flint. "It's classic. They want control. They want to make you a problem that needs solving." I didn't want pity. I wanted leverage. We needed a legal counterweight, and Judge Elias Thorne, a retired jurist who thought the world had let itself get sloppy, was the kind of man who could read a clause and see the intention behind the grammar. Thorne didn't mince words. When he read the clause about mental clarity, he tapped it with a pencil and said, "They're trying to strip you of agency." We'll flip that argument. We prepared evidence the way a deployment is prepared, methodically. Bank records. Old surveys. The wartime easements that placed a portion of Salt Hollow under historic military usage. Testimony from neighbors who remembered when the land was used for training. We lined up the paper like a wall. But paper is slow. The first fight I wanted to win was public opinion, not because I was desperate for headlines, but because community memory can be a faster blade than any lawyer. I called Isabel Diaz at the county paper. Isabel is not sentimental. She's a reporter who respects a story with facts and the spine to stand with them. I told her exactly what I had, the agreement, the clause, the history of the land, and the quiet pressure my children had been applying this past year in the name of planning for the future. Her piece ran 3 days later with a headline that cut clean: decorated veteran and landowner pressured by her children to sign away historic property. The comments came in like a second tide. Farmers who brought eggs to my kitchen, veterans who remembered my husband's steadiness, Folks who'd seen me at vote drives and town meetings, they wrote. Suddenly, strangers who remembered our family showed up on my porch with casseroles and stories. Community is small-town potent in upstate New York. Once people remember you, they speak up. That didn't stop the quiet attacks. An anonymous zoning complaint, a whisper at church, a taxman's casual question about an old ledger entry that looked more like curiosity than threat until it stacked. They tried the slow squeeze. Marcus tried an old bank login by mistake. The bank flagged it and called me. Claire suggested we restructure things for efficiency. Sophie texted that she wanted a calm discussion. All of that stuff was reconnaissance. I wasn't interested in drama. I was interested in truth. I filed the conservation draft Thomas had penned years ago. It wasn't dramatic or flashy. It was the sort of legal hinge that closed doors quietly but effectively. At the same time, Judge Thorne and Joseph Maddox, my lawyer who knew how to make men in suits uncomfortable, put together emergency motions. The court froze accounts linked to the LLC Marcus had formed. The restraining orders arrived like a practical hymn, efficient, absolute, and non-spectacular. But the personal part of this war was the hardest. I had to look at the faces of the people I'd raised and see the strangers behind them. They thought they were being practical. They thought they were securing the ranch. They'd forgotten that ownership isn't just an asset. It's memory, responsibility, and in my case, the place I'd promised my husband would be preserved. That night I walked the stone walls. I found myself at his grave under the cottonwood and felt the old grief like something with teeth. I promised him, not theatrically, just as a fact, that I wasn't going to let this place be moved aside. I'd fought for a lot of things in my life. I hadn't been prepared for a siege made by my own blood. They came to dinner like it was a negotiation. I set the table with his mother's china, the plates that had survived decades of clumsy hands and holiday laughter. I wanted them to remember normal things before the conversation began. Perhaps that was sentimental. Perhaps it was a weapon. I lit the fire and waited. When we sat, Marcus tried the practiced approach. Soft voice, big eyes. "This is for your protection," he said, as if protection could be a document. Claire offered that this was about family future, about logistics, about custodial flexibility and legacy restructuring. Sophie said nothing. She watched and measured. "I filed the conservation easement this morning," I said. The sentence landed the way an ordered action does, precise, irrevocable. The room went thin. They had prepared arguments, emails, and spreadsheets. They hadn't prepared for my evidence. Then McKenna did something that ended the pretense. Quietly, into my scarf mic she whispered, audio recorded. "Video stable." I could see the unmake on their faces, the slow dropping of bravado as something real and undeniable took hold. Within hours, the sheriff brought papers. The LLC was flagged. The bank freezes held. Marcus's attempt at access became a legal matter rather than a family misstep. There was a mess after. There always is. Accusations came from both sides. I got letters that hinted at missteps I'd made decades ago. Tax filings, unreported inheritances, small human mistakes. Those are the knives people throw when a person is cornered, not sharp, but enough to make people look twice. I didn't dodge, I addressed. Judge Thorne and Joseph had covered the legal angles. The community stood where it mattered. That didn't heal the wounds, but it gave me space to think. Months passed in a blur of depositions and neighborhood conversations. I learned to hold my tongue when family tried the guilt approach. I learned to keep a record when facts were more useful than speeches. Marcus took a plea for attempted misuse of accounts, probation, and restitution. Sophie's attorney offered mediation, a shallow olive branch. Claire sent a package of photos, a younger Thomas, a younger me at commissioning in dress blues, a life we had all shared once. Jenna, Claire's old friend who'd shown up at the porch halfway through the fight, surprised us all. She came back alone, with a tired face and an apology. She said aloud that she'd been jealous of Thomas's trust in me. She handed me a folder of old photos she'd found in an attic somewhere. They were nothing legally useful, but they were human, a reminder that before the paperwork we'd been people. I didn't burn the bridges for spite. I closed them because I needed to, I told Marcus the terms plainly. 1 year without contact while you prove you can live honestly, make restitution, and show actual change. It wasn't cruel. It was accountability. Salt Hollow slowly changed. The conservation easement made selling the land impossible, but it did more than block a sale. It gave me the freedom to decide what the land would mean next. If inheritance was going to be more than a ledger entry, then it had to be something beyond family wealth. Thomas had once scribbled a note about creating a place for veterans who needed a second start. I dusted off that note and turned it into a plan. We formed a nonprofit. We listed a few acres for small cabins near the South Pasture, places where women who'd served could come and relearn daily things, how to cook for themselves again, how to sleep without the hypervigilance of service, how to start a small business or work with counselors to find purpose. Those were practical offerings: job training, counseling rooms, and on-site liaison to get veterans connected with benefits. It was also symbolic, turning a fight into a gift. Running the sanctuary required logistics that made my old deployments look like warm-ups. Fundraising, zoning permissions, grant writing, things I'd never expected to be my work in retirement were suddenly my daily grind. I delegated, hired, and learned. The first woman who moved in brought nothing but a small duffel and a weary smile. She taught me something I hadn't known I needed to learn: how to be a place where someone could fall apart and be reassembled without judgment. People came to help. Neighbors who had once whispered at the feed store brought tools and time. Volunteers drove in from the city to teach digital literacy classes in the small barn we converted into a classroom. The county granted a small support fund after seeing the community impact. We planted a lavender garden because it smelled like calm and because small routines help rebuild a life. Sophie returned one autumn afternoon with her daughter, 9 years old, carrying a casserole and the kind of mundane bravery that families learn when they try to repair what's been broken. "The place feels different," Sophie said, and I didn't need more than that. Her comment felt like a tiny proof, like a herb finally taking in the garden. I don't pretend everything is whole. The children's estrangement left scars that don't fade with paperwork. But the ranch, the land, became what I had always wanted it to be: a place of service and shelter, not a ledger entry. The first cabin opened with a small ribbon and a lot of hands. We celebrated quietly because that's how real things grow, slowly and with sweat. Some nights I sit on the back porch where I once watched the sunrise over the fields and count the lights in the South Pasture. Cabins with windows aglow, the soft murmur of a dinner being shared, a kettle whistling. I think of Thomas and my younger self in that commissioning photo, and I feel both the ache and the pride. I tell my children if they want to be part of this place, they have to be better people first. That's simple and final. When the lavender came up early that spring, it smelled like something that had weathered winter and decided to bloom anyway. I put my hand on the old gravestone and felt the cool of the stone under my palm. The ranch breathed around me, not as an inheritance to be traded, but as a promise kept. The headlines stopped mattering. What mattered was a woman learning to sleep through the night in a cabin she could call hers, a child who might one day choose this place, and a land that would be held for more than wallets and wills. I lost an idea of what family means and found a different kind of keeping, a place where dignity and service were the true legacy. That's the part one wanted to call mine, and in the quiet after the fight, that's what I built. As winter pulled back and the first warm days stretched across the Hudson Valley, I found myself walking the property at dusk. The cabins in the South Pasture glowed like lanterns scattered across the field. Inside one of them, I could hear soft laughter, the kind that comes from tired people finally beginning to breathe again. That sound meant more to me than any inheritance ever could. I stopped by the old cottonwood tree where Thomas rested. The ground was thawing, small shoots breaking through. I stood there longer than usual, letting the quiet settle. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like something closing in. It felt like a space opening up. I kept the promise, I whispered. Not out of grief. Not out of anger. Just truth. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of earth and lavender. I looked back toward the house, the porch light glowing, the windows warm, a place rebuilt not through force or fear, but through boundary and choice. My phone buzzed once. A message from Sophie. Mom, she wants to spend the summer with you. Is that okay? I smiled because I didn't need to think about it. Yes, she's always welcome here. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept walking the fence line, boots crunching in the soft gravel. The ranch felt steady again. Not untouched. Not perfect. Just steady, rebuilt on what mattered instead of what was expected. People think strength is loud. They think it's a raised voice or a slammed door. They're wrong. Strength is quiet. It's the moment you stop begging people to understand you and start choosing the life you'll protect, even if you have to build it from the ground up. By the time I circled back to the porch, the sky had gone dark, the stars sharp and clear above the ridgeline. I took one last look at the fields, the history, the hurt, the healing, all of it layered into the land the way roots thread into soil. This place wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was mine again.